Erwin Panofsky's book Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism is a classic work of medieval scholarship. Panofsky was a German art historian who wrote a great deal about art history and Christian iconography. In this small volume, first published in 1951, Panofsky tries to do something really fascinating. He tries to find links between scholasticism, which is a particular approach to learning and philosophy, and Gothic architecture, those impressive cathedrals that still dominate European cities. According to Panofsky, something happened in the 13th century, particularly in the region around Paris, that caused these two movements to reach their high point at roughly the same time. Panofsky places this climactic phase during the reign of the French king Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis. At that point, there existed what Panofsky calls a mental habit that was shared by architects and intellectuals. It's not as if the architect spent much of his time reading writers like St. Thomas Aquinas or Alexander of Hales. Rather, certain ways of thinking and looking at the world were simply in the air. So what was scholasticism, and what did it have in common with Gothic architecture? During what is sometimes called the Second Feudal Age, more and more learning took place out of the monasteries and in the burgeoning cities. In cathedral schools and universities, in the convents of friars, scholars sought to create a vast system of knowledge that would harmonize reason and faith. Influenced by the works of Aristotle, which had recently been rediscovered and translated, there was tremendous optimism that through rigorous reasoning, all questions could be answered. We can see this belief in an orderly universe in the layout of scholastic texts. These books, often using the title Summa, are not just short summaries. They are somewhat like massive encyclopedias, covering a vast array of topics, and organizing them meticulously into different subsections. Consider Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, which is organized into partes, membra, quaestiones, articuli, and then objections and responses. Everything is laid out neatly. This approach is foreshadowed by earlier writers. For example, in canon law, the law of the Church, the 12th century canonist lawyer Gratian produced a legal work he called Concordia Discordantium Canonum, the Concord of Discordant Canons, or, in plain English, the harmonizing of contradictory rules. More controversial was Peter Abelard, also from the 12th century. You might know about his tragic love affair with Héloïse, which led to a series of famous letters, and also, unfortunately for Abelard, to his castration by a band of men hired by Héloïse's uncle. But there's more to Abelard than his famous love life. Abelard wrote a book called Sic et Non, Yes and No, which includes 158 questions about apparent contradictions in the writings of the Church Fathers. In his introduction, Abelard provided a set of rules for how to resolve such contradictions. However, he scandalously did not provide the answer key for his own book. The scholastic method was fully developed in the 13th century, when it was applied to virtually every intellectual problem. In academic settings, scholars would stage public debates called disputationes de quod libet, literally, debates about whatever. Debaters would take opposite positions, and then a master would provide a resolution. The same approach is used in Aquinas' Summa. Each question or quaestio starts with one viewpoint, it would seem. Then we get the opposite view, on the contrary. And then we proceed to the solution, I answer that. In this way, the scholastics both respected the ancient authorities, including the Church Fathers, and forged new systems of thought. For Panofsky, the best word to sum up the scholastic habit of mind is the word manifestation. Faith and reason are not opposed, but reason manifests or demonstrates faith. It provides clarification and elucidation. In a Gothic cathedral, the light that comes flooding in through the larger windows reveals the harmony of the natural world and the realm of worship. Similarly, the ordered design of piers and arches and buttresses mirrors the order of the universe. A cathedral is a manifestation of knowledge. It is a kind of book or summa. On its pages can be read the unity of faith and reason. Manifestation includes several key aspects. We see this in how writers wrote a summa. First, they believed in the need for totality, or sufficient enumeration. You must cover a complete range of topics. For example, if you're going to talk about the 7 deadly sins, you can't skip any. Secondly, the parts of your text, or cathedral, as we'll see, must be arranged in parallel ways. Panofsky uses the word homologous, which means having the same structure. Each section of a summa needs to be organized similarly. For example, if you're talking about the sin of pride in relation to its specific vices as well as its opposed virtue, humility, then when you move on to the sin of anger, you better do the same. Panofsky calls this sufficient articulation. Finally, we must have sufficient interrelation. For Panofsky, this means a few things. In a summa, each viewpoint must be both expressed individually, by itself, as a unique perspective, and must be related clearly to the argument as a whole. In other words, there's a tension between the part and the whole, and they should be perfectly balanced or interrelated. In a cathedral, we have the same thing. A structural element, like a column for instance, is designed as a unique and individual part of the church. But its design is also related to the rest of the cathedral. Panofsky gives an example of how the balance between the part and the whole can be off. In the late Gothic church of Pirna, Germany, the net vault ceiling is much too intricate for the simpler columns. This is a case of over-membrification. It would be as if we wrote a book on the 7 deadly sins and spent most of our time talking about pride while neglecting the sin of sloth. But there's one more aspect of sufficient interrelation. Not only must the part and the whole relate properly, but Panofsky also mentions the importance of deductive cogency. The idea is that if you know the part, you can deduce what the whole should be like. At one point, Panofsky even claims, quote, "The classic style demands that we be able to infer not only the interior from the exterior, or the shape of the side aisles from that of the central nave, but also, say, the organization of the whole system from the cross-section of one pier. By looking at a single element, we can deduce the rest." So far, we focus mostly on scholasticism. Now it's time to switch our attention increasingly to Gothic architecture. Before Gothic, the dominant style was what we call Romanesque. Romanesque churches were common from roughly 900 to 1200. They tended to have much thicker walls, fewer and smaller windows with rounded arches, and different kinds of vaulted ceilings. Gothic architecture is marked by the use of pointed arches. The advantage was that instead of pushing the weight outwards, which creates more lateral thrust, requiring massive walls, a pointed arch pushes the weight downwards into the piers below. This allows for much larger windows, which lets more light enter the church. To support the thinner walls, architects added buttresses on the sides of the church. Gothic churches also replaced the different types of Romanesque vaults with the rib vault. Here again, architects used a pointed arch, decreasing the lateral thrust. They also decreased the weight of the stones used on the roof. The result was that the nave of the church was increasingly high and light came flooding in. Panofsky argues that the High Gothic plan, or system, was a perfect manifestation of the harmony of reason and faith, of the nature of God as revealed in creation. We see this when we look at the ground plan of a Gothic cathedral. There are 3 main areas: the nave, the transept, which makes the church have the shape of a cross, and the chevet. All other parts that might detract from this Trinitarian structure are suppressed. For that reason, we don't have too many towers, typically just 2. The galleries and the crypt are not prominent, and so on. Then, within each area, we have the separation into clear parts, or what Panofsky calls membrification. For example, the nave has clearly marked side aisles, and the chevet consists of the apse, where the altar is, the ambulatory or walkway around the apse, and the chapels. This organization extends into the columns and rib vaults above, with each vaulted ceiling being constructed along a similar pattern and having a homologous relation to the others. In this way, a bay in the nave can be compared to, let's say, a chapel in the chevet. We see here the visual equivalent of how scholastics looked for similarities or analogies between different domains of knowledge. For example, you might compare the mystery of the three persons of the Trinity to how in the mind of humans there is an interrelation between being, knowledge, and love. This kind of analogy allows us to create a bridge between the world of mystery and faith and the world of reason and knowledge. The architect uses analogies between different parts of the church so that the structure forms a unified whole. This is evident everywhere in Gothic architecture. As we enter the church, we see that unlike in Romanesque architecture, the tympanum and the archivolts are clearly divided into separate sections. Inside the church, when we look up, we see that the walls of the nave are divided into three parts: the arcade, the triforium, and the clerestory, and that in each part we can distinguish between different levels of tracery. Increasingly, we also see how the piers express the entire architecture of the church. Earlier, the nave walls, or arcades, had piers that were often monocylindrical. But this simplicity did not match the complexity of the other parts of the church. For example, it didn't line up with the structure of the rib vault. An early solution was to use a compound pier that had 4 smaller colonnettes on the side. This design allowed the pier to match the transverse ribs of the nave and side aisles, as well as line up with the arcade wall. But it didn't express the diagonal ribs of the vaults. So increasingly, we see a much more elaborate design, where the smaller colonnettes entirely reflect the structure of the ceiling above. In this way, we have sufficient articulation, enumeration, and interrelation. And in this way, a single pier tells us about the rest of the cathedral. The scholastic habit of mind also explains how Gothic architects dealt with the problems they faced. They felt that whatever was rational was also aesthetic and practical. For example, when we look at a buttress supporting the wall, we should not think that this is only a practical solution. Neither is it only an artistic solution, as when some flying buttresses appear to be mostly decorative and not necessary for support. Instead, the scholastic habit of mind aims to place aesthetics and utility in the service of rationalism and faith. Panofsky also argues that the scholastic habit of mind explains how architects changed their designs over time. Just as the writers of the day synthesized the sayings of the ancient authorities like the Church Fathers, always using the dialectical approach, in the same way architects looked at design elements from the past as so many different viewpoints that had to be harmonized into a working system. Panofsky writes, "For these architects, the great structures of the past had an auctoritas quite similar to that which the fathers had for the schoolmen. Of two apparently contradictory motifs, both of them sanctioned by authority, one of them could not simply be rejected in favor of the other. They had to be worked through to the limit, and they had to be reconciled in the end." To illustrate this idea, Panofsky gives 3 examples. First, a key innovation in Gothic architecture was the addition of a rose window to the western exterior of the church. This was like adding a giant "no" to the "yes" of the church blueprint. It was so big and different that the challenge was to reconcile it with the rest of the structure. If it filled the entire front of the nave, then the side aisles and their respective portals would be too small. Different architects had different solutions. For example, the Notre Dame in Paris has a 5-part nave, but a 3-part western exterior, which allows for the side portals to be sufficiently wide that they are not affected by the width of the rose window. The final solution that architects came up with was to place the rose inside a huge window with a pointed arch. This way, the window could be raised or lowered without affecting other elements. Now the original church plan and the contraposition are truly reconciled. Panofsky gives two more examples of such innovation. We can see both of them in this photo of the choir of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis. First of all, architects tried to ensure that the triforium lined up with the clear story while still remaining distinct and separate. Here the triforium is divided into 4 parts that line up beautifully with the 4-part window above. Just like in nature, as Aristotle described it, everything has a genus and a species, so here the arched openings of the triforium are repeated as members of the same species. Notice how the columns connect with the mullions of the windows above, with the middle one being thicker with 3 shafts instead of 1. Finally, the photo shows one last problem that the architects tried to resolve. The difficulty was what to do with the capital of each pier. This created a break between the pier and the higher elements. The challenge was to create continuity and harmony while retaining the separateness of the pier. The solution? Allow some of the colonnettes to continue past the capital uninterrupted. These shafts extend all the way upwards to connect with the ribs of the vault above. Here we see the triumph of the scholastic habit of mind, creating unity out of diversity. This brings us to one final question. Given the amazing achievements of scholasticism and Gothic architecture, why did things change, particularly in the 14th century? What caused the demise of high Gothic architecture and scholastic philosophy? Panofsky argues that later thinkers critique the balance between reason and faith and soul and body. The result was the emergence of 2 contrasting movements. In the first place, in philosophy we get nominalism, a school of thought promoted by William of Ockham and others. Nominalists denied the real existence of universals. A scholastic philosopher looking at a cat would say that there's the individual cat and there's the universal idea or form of the cat. This universal has a reality to it. On the other hand, Panofsky quotes Peter Aureolus as saying, "Everything is individual by virtue of itself and by nothing else. There are only particulars. Anything else is just a mental abstraction." This focus on the world of the senses shattered the absolute faith in the powers of reason. And, as a result, all problems of metaphysics and theology can increasingly be discussed only in terms of probability, not certainty. Meanwhile, in theology, we witness an increasing mysticism, which suggests that God must be experienced primarily through emotion and faith, rather than through reason. Whereas nominalism tries to save rationalism by cutting the tie between reason and faith, mysticism does the opposite. It saves faith by removing it from the world of rational thought. But what both movements have in common is what Panofsky calls subjectivism. Increasingly, I can only understand the world through my individual psychological perspective. This subjectivism also shows up in art. A good example is the work of Klaus Sluter. Notice the way the figures are more pictorial, more 3-dimensional, looking in a particular direction. This 3D effect emphasizes the sense of perspective, how we see the world from a specific point of view. Gone is the sense of the universal, and increasingly we see an emphasis on individual perception and psychology and empiricism. This shift is also evident in perpendicular architecture, a late Gothic style employed in England. One feature of perpendicular architecture is the 4-centered arch, which allowed for much wider windows than the traditional Gothic curved arch. Now that the window was wider and had more mullions and transoms, the opportunities for emotive pictorial storytelling increased. In this way, then, Gothic architecture and scholasticism were transformed and critiqued, though at the same time their influence remains with us to this day. From the structured organization of books, to the division of time in music, to the literary achievements of a writer like Dante, whose Divine Comedy has a tripartite organization with detailed memorification in cantos, we witness the widespread impact of this habit of thought. And just as we continue to read the great scholastic writers, men like Aquinas, so we can appreciate the sublime achievements of Gothic architecture. And given how these cathedrals brought together the universal and the particular, it is only fitting that the individual architects who designed them became famous enough to be remembered by name. Their achievement was to apply the dialectical method to the world of architecture and create some of the most awe-inspiring wonders of the world.